Howdy, peeps. Today, we're going to go back to book club. That's right, the JJ Thrives on Book Club to talk about this book, Amazing Grace. Join the Journey Radio starts right now.
Welcome to the infusion of positive energy into the lives of single Latter-day Saints everywhere. This is Joy in the Journey Radio.
And welcome back, peeps, to another wonderful, splendid, and joyous episode of Join the Journey Radio. I am Lance, your host for Join the Journey Radio, and this is episode number 383, Amazing Grace. So, yeah, peeps, if you're here joining us live for the program, please join the chat. Tell us where you're from. If you're viewing this program at a later time, leave a comment down below. Let us know where you're from, because that will help us with the algorithms. So today we're going to go back to the JJ Thrive Zone Book Club to talk about this book. Like I said before, Amazing Grace. This is a historical fiction novel about the life of John Newton, who was the man who wrote the song Amazing Grace. So the book is a biography, but it's written in the style of fiction, which is why I call it historical fiction. I must say this book was a real gem, and I learned a thing or two about, what did I learn about? Oh yes, the history of the slave trade, because that's what the song was essentially about. I learned about how the slave trade came to eventually be disapproved by society at large. And it was really interesting to see. Now, well, let me just say this. Like, the biographical information is totally interesting. Um, but the way that they carve it out is like a history novel, right? I mean, it's just like, it was really, really cool. What can I say? I really enjoyed it. um, it's just really good reading. Of course, not exactly written from the perspective of a upstanding, active Latter-day Saint, um, but I'd say for the most part, like the religious overtones I found in it were not what an upstanding Latter-day Saint would find objectionable. It runs pretty in line with what you would consider mainstream. I'm thinking about C.S. Lewis and Mere Christianity, where he said at the beginning of the book, look, we're not trying to define, we're not trying to play sex against each other. We're just trying to say, what's the bare bones basics that all Christians would agree on, right? And that's pretty much what you find here in this book. Um, the thing I liked about it is the fiction aspect of it, because yeah, it is biographical, so it's based on true events, but a lot of like the details that make the story like worth getting into, it really they use the tools of fiction to fill in a lot of those blanks and with the details. So it makes for a very, very interesting read. So let's dig into this. I'm gonna get something about this like this new yeah, this oh, you gotta be kidding me. So trying to figure out this new platform here. Bear with me, peeps. Bear with me. Here we go. This one. Um, let's see if I can switch over here. I'm gonna add to the stream. Oh, that's lovely. Okay. I'm digging this chili. So here we go. We're gonna go talk about this book, Amazing Grace, and essentially, well, this is going to be a little different right? Because normally when the books that we feature here on Book Club are nonfiction, and this is historical fiction based on real events. Um, Actually, I really should call it like biographical fiction, is what I really should call it. Because, when I say the term historical fiction, some people might be thinking about, okay, so it's basically a fictional story that plays with historical events, right? So it actually explains the history that we already know, or it gives you an alternative history that developed because they're fictional characters and you can make them do things that they didn't actually normally do and make history take a turn other than the history that we know. So it goes off on a different line. Um, that's historical fiction. So I should probably really call this biographical fiction because it generally follows the biographical sketch of John Newton's life, but it does it with using the tools of fiction. It's really interesting. So, normally, like I was saying before, I like give little quotes and I explain how these quotes apply to the lives of Latter-day Saint singles. I make analogies to the challenges that LDS singles face in their life, and I'm going to do that with this one, but um, it's something I'm going to do a little different, right? So I'm going to give you a little bit of the introduction. So this is not the actual biographical fiction, the main part of the book, right? And then I'm going to give you um, I'm calling them snippets. The first one is like several pages out of the book because I wanted to demonstrate like what you find in the book. Like a lot of the things that I enjoyed out of the book, and I just can't take like a little paragraph or two. I got to take, pages. So yeah, let's just dig into this. So if I can get back to here we go. So starting off here, we're looking at part of the introduction. So these are the authors of the book. Um, this is entirely right. They're just giving you an introduction before you get into the actual life of John Newton. They're talking about the song Amazing Grace. The hymn is figured prominently at moments of intense national grieving in America. After the Space Shuttle Challenger burst into flames on television in 1986, I still remember that, the American people heard Amazing Grace played at the memorial service for the astronauts. After domestic terrorists exploded a bomb at an Oklahoma City federal building in 1995, killing 168 people, Amazing Grace was again carried from church services by television news programs. The memorial mass for John F. Kennedy Jr. in July 1999 concluded with the singing of Amazing Grace as well. Another typo. I gotta do something about these typos. I don't know why I'm not seeing them beforehand. In 2001, immediately after the terrorist attacks on September 11th, a spontaneous candlelight vigil began in Union Square, and people started again to sing Amazing Grace. This did not just happen in New York. Amazing Grace was sung at both formal and ad hoc. Okay, come on. Here you go. Here we go. Ad hoc memorials across the United States. This song continues to be sung at commemorations of the event and in other times of public tragedy and private grief. Examples abound. Amazing Grace is, as one critic observed, the spiritual anthem of America. I'd say that's not too far from the truth. Perhaps even more remarkably, the song that was written by a former slave trader has been taken up by African American congregations and made their own. Now that is remarkable, since the song was inspired by, this guy who was participating in the slave trade, and then he had events that turned things around for him, which we'll get into. So yeah, it is remarkable that the descendants of these people that he enslaved are actually taking up the song that he wrote and making it their own. This was true before and after emancipation in America. Amazing Grace became a song of personal testimony. It was gospel music greats like Mahalia Jackson who offered the song to a wider audience yet. She recorded Amazing Grace for Apollo Records on December 10, 1947. Her soulful version of the hymn was played on the radio in the immediate post war years and helped to move Amazing Grace into the popular consciousness once and for all. It was there to be sung during the civil rights movement. It was there to be sung during the Vietnam years. It was there for everyone who needed a prayer for grace in times of pain and unrelenting wretchedness. Now, when I read this in the book, I just thought to myself, first of all, I'd never even heard of Mahalia Jackson. But then again, I'm not really that into like gospel music, so maybe that explains that. So I went in and actually looked it up, right? It's like I went and looked up the whole Mahalia Jackson deal, and I said I want to hear what the authors are talking about here. Recording for Apollo. Now I know Apollo Records, right? Apollo Records produced a lot of jazz greats, um, and I like jazz music, so among other various genres. So I know Apollo Records, right? But I never heard of Mahalia Jackson. And I thought, let's, do miracles of modern technology. It's like, yeah, I could just look this up and find it, right? I can look this up and find it. So, yeah, let's see if we can bring in. Um, so I have a little video recording. Another thing I don't like about this new platform is like I can't just play audio, right? I can't play audio, right? Like I have to play video. I can't I can play video with audio, obviously, because I've done that before. But I could play if I wanted to. I could play video without the audio, but I can't play audio without the video. Video is compulsory. Reminds me of that scene from Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are Dead. I don't know if you ever see that movie, but if you like if you're kind of literary bent, you like a movie with witty dialogue, doesn't necessarily have a lot of action to it. Um, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are Dead is right up your alley. There's this scene where they meet this traveling group of actors, and it's the same group of actors. For those who don't know, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are minor characters in Shakespeare's play Hamlet. And what Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are Dead, it's a film by Tom Stoppard that was based on a play that Tom Stoppard wrote. And it's basically taking these minor characters from Shakespeare's play and telling the story with them as major characters in the story. So it flips things around. And there's a lot of really witty dialogue. And of course, since it's Shakespeare, there's a lot of like literature allegories and references. And if that's the kind of thing, I'm sort of that kind of guy. So if that's your thing, then you really love this movie. But there's this one scene. So the traveling actors, the same ones that show up in Hamlet, right? They meet them on the road, and there's this scene. It's like, well, what can we do for you? And he's giving listing like all the different types of plays that they could do. It's just like, um, yeah, well, we can give you blood. we, we can give you blood. We give you tragedy. We give you blood with the tragedy. We give you tragedy with the blood. But we can't give you tragedy without the blood. They're all blood, you see. And um, I know I'm messing that up. I should just stick with this, right? Let's just stick with the book. Let's just stick with them. So I went and looked for Mahalia Jackson. So I ended up, grabbing a video off of YouTube. So this is not my video, but um, what I'm looking for is the sound of Mahalia Jackson. And oh my gosh, I was just like, seriously, like again, I'm not like a gospel music guy. This woman's got soul, right? Check this.
Oh, and grace, how sweet the sound that saved your wretched life.
What can I say? I mean, that's impressive. I just like I heard that I was just blown away. If you never heard that, seriously, peeps, if you have never heard that woman's voice before, this is your first time hearing it, and you're not blown away like I am, then you need to get your hearing checked. Seriously, that woman has got talent. Um, so yeah, I was like, well, okay, great. I learned something new. Like I learned like lots of stuff from the book, but the book helped me lead something off to find. Oh yeah, this is great. Lots of learning here. Enjoy the dirty radio. All right, let's get back to our little. Oh yes, little slideshow here. All right, so there's the introduction. Here's another excerpt from the introduction. Where do we find hope today in the midst of deep divisions in society and violent disagreements? Where do we find hope for the human condition? Where do we find hope for all the griefs and sorrows that threaten to undo our lives? Perhaps we need to look again at the perennial message of amazing grace. Perhaps here we might find a renewed hope that however difficult the troubles in our lives, however deep our personal shame and regret, however dark the evil that stalks the earth, there is a mercy that is deeper yet, a forgiveness that makes all the difference, and a power for reconciliation greater than ourselves. The 250th anniversary of the writing of the hymn by John Newton is a fitting occasion to discover the remarkable story behind the song and to learn something of the dramatic life of its author. In this story is a message of grace for us all today, one we need to hear now more than ever. And I have to say, it's part of the reason why I picked up the book. Because, of course, I'm familiar with the song, but I didn't really know much about John Newton. um, so, yeah, I was just like, yeah, let's pick this up. And like I said, it was a very enjoyable read. So, let's see, one more excerpt from the intro. In Newton's story, we see a clear illustration of the fact that nobody comes to Christ painlessly or all at once. That, though the gift of grace is freely given, none of us receive the gospel without having to go deeper, well beyond the moment of initial conversion. The more we become aware of how deep is our need for grace, another typo, the more we understand how precious a gift it is. And so Newton's story is a journey of discovery, a journey we must all travel ourselves. In Newton's life, we see a parable of how we need grace far more than we initially thought. We see that we have been complicit in things that have been deeply hurtful to others. We see that the older we get, the more we need grace, for the closer we get to the light, the more impurities show up. Maturity means knowing more and more how much we stand in need of God's grace, and walking, therefore, with humility and gentleness, just as Newton did, But at every step, God is at work, calling us home to Himself. There is room enough yet in the story for all. And what I really liked about this quote, like, doesn't this really just describe us all? I mean, seriously. I mean, as Latter-day Saint singles, I mean, we realize that, I mean, if we look deep within ourselves, right? Because it's what he says here. This is not just one and done. Conversion is not an event, but rather a process. I like to describe it as a journey. Um, and so it's something that takes a lifetime to go through. Um, but the further we get into it, the more we realize we can't save ourselves. We need a savior. Um, and as it says here, we see we've been complicit in things that have been deeply hurtful to others. Now, I'm sure that describes a lot of Latter-day Saint singles. Not because they're singles, or saints just because they're human. That's just part of the human condition. We see it the older we get, the more we need grace. For the closer we get to the light, the more impurities show up. I would say that it's not that the more impurities show up. The impurities were always there. We just didn't see them as clearly. But the closer we get to the light, the better we can see what actually is there. Maturity means knowing more and more how much we stand in need of God's grace. Spiritual maturity, I'd say it's definitely true. Walking therefore with humility and gentleness, just as Newton did. But at every step, God is at work, calling some to Himself. There's room enough yet in this story for us all. And again, second, every word of that. Okay, so what I want to go into now is, like I said before, like several. This is going to be a little different because normally I don't do more than an excerpt that lasts, a couple pages. And this excerpt here is going to be several pages long. So we're coming here in like the middle of the book. So before we get into this excerpt, let me just share with you a little bit about, what's happened in his life so far. So he grows up in England. His father is a sea captain. Um, and so, he grows up with this idea of, being at sea. But then he meets this girl and falls in love. And then he gets press ganged into the Navy. And he does okay with that. He actually increases his standing. He earns rank, for good behavior. And then one day, when the ship is docked on the shore, the crew's on shore leave, and so he gets charged with a group of sailors. They're part of the crew, that he's responsible for making sure that they come back from shore leave. Well, he gets this crazy idea in his head when he's on shore. I'm gonna go see my girl. So he goes off, go see his girl, comes to find a, a patrol of army troops that are looking for him because they think he's deserted. And they treat him as such, right? They capture him, they bring him back to the ship, he's flogged, he's stripped of his rank. And so now the crew members that he once oversaw, he's now lower than they are. And so he's totally humiliated. And he just takes a bad turn. So he starts getting a bad reputation as a troublemaker. And in the process of sailing across the sea, they run across a trading ship. And apparently, in the 1700s, when ships met, if they were friendly, you're not meeting a ship from an enemy nation, right? So if they're friendly, you'd come around and he's like, "Hey, what do you got? Let's trade." And that trade bargain could include people. So if you want to get rid of people that you don't want on your boat because they're more trouble than they're worth to you, then you might try to bargain for them. And that's what they did with Newton, right? He got traded off, put onto this trading ship. The trading ship was, sailing down to Africa. And so he ends up getting traded again off of this trading ship into this factory, as they called it. And basically, it's a place where they processed slaves before they were shipped from Africa over to the Americans and to the Caribbean. So he gets actually entrapped there at this slave factory, and becomes a slave himself, uh, horribly mistreated. Um, he's saved eventually by someone that his father had sent um, to go look for him, go find my son, bring him home. So he saves Newton from this period of enslavement. And then Newton starts picking up the slave trade himself, and he starts getting involved in the slave trade, which you kind of have to wonder about that one. Because he's like, wait, how do you go from being a slave to then being a slave trader? It's like, wouldn't you think that, like, your experience under oppression would give you compassion and empathy and encourage you not to give those things to other people because you know what it's like to be on the receiving end of that stick. But uh, you know, we'll get into that a little bit later. There's the quote I have towards the end of the book where the authors talk about it. And he talked about it. I mean, he wrote an autobiography, when he was like 40 something. And he talks about, excuse me, he talks about that period of his life. Um, so the expert we're going to have now is, he's on this ship. They just, so the way it works is because they're sailing ships, they're relying on wind for propulsion, right? So they come down and they go down to Africa, and then they head west. Like the winds are blowing west, right? And that takes them over to the Caribbean, where they then drop off their slaves, and then they buy, get sugar and anything else that they want to trade up, and then they come up north, towards Canada, and then come back around because that's the way the winds are blowing, blows in a circle, right? So then they take those winds from Canada, and then they just sail on there for the British Isles and home. So what we're reading now is an account of the trip. It was he was on this He's on this ship. It's called the Greyhound, and the ship had just left Canada, and so they're on their way eastward across the North Atlantic. So check out the just the way that just the way the authors are writing this. I really like this. It's not like any biography I've ever read, because again they put those elements of fiction into it. John woke to a cold blast of wind and sea water. "Storm!" yelled one of the crew as he descended the ladder into the cabin and searched frantically among the captain's possessions by the light of a wildly swaying lamp. "The ship is sinking! Get out there and help!" John leapt out of bed and started to climb the ladder, struggling to keep his balance as the ship lurched from side to side. It was 3 in the morning. "Go back!" a voice shouted at him from above. He looked up and saw the captain's form filling the hatch above him. His face was wild and desperate. Between him and the dark sky above, John could see the tattered remnants of the sail whipping in air. "I need a knife, Newton. Fetch me one from my chest." John turned back and joined in the search, holding the lamp while the sailor who had roused him emptied the chest. "I have it." His Okay, that should say crewmate. Gosh, gotta get rid of these. Uh, I'm not finding as many typos as I found the last time, so maybe there's some improvement here. "I have it," his crewmate shouted before barreling up the ladder. John was right behind him, hands clamped tight on each rung. He was about to take the final step off the ladder and onto the main deck when a mighty wave rolled over the ship, sweeping the first sailor from his feet. His screams, as well as the cries of most of the livestock as they were hurled from the ship, vanished as soon as he was swallowed by the raging sea. Somewhere nearby, John heard timber breaking apart. There was more shouting and screaming. John stood frozen, hoping he was dreaming, but knowing it was real. "Newton!" the captain yelled, pointing to the hold. "Help with the pumps!" Another wave swept the last of the pigs and shipped sheep overboard. John hurried as best as he could over to the one man, lashed to the gunwale, operating one of the two pumps that were fixed to the deck near the entrance to the hold, and saw that it was full of water. "Tie yourself on," shouted the sailor, nodding to a length of rope nearby. "We can't afford to lose any more men." For the next hour John operated the second pump. The sea continued to pitch the Greyhound violently in all directions. Waves routinely surged over them, and more than once John lost his footing and was only saved by the rope. The wind whipped sea water and rain into his eyes, and the sound of breaking timber caused the rest of the men to shout and scream in terror. Only when there were flashes of lightning could John see clearly. The waves above them as tall as a cathedral, the sails in shreds clinging weakly to the masts. The rest of the crew, those lucky enough to have survived, all exhausted, some frantic and hysterical as they fought for survival. It was 3 in the morning when John started pumping, and he continued through dawn and into the morning. The storm eased a little around daylight, but the relief they felt was only temporary. Finally they could see the full extent of the damage. A large section of the upper bow of the ship was smashed and letting in water. The sails were almost completely ruined. Nothing that had not been tied to the deck remained. None of the livestock, none of the supplies. One of the crew had already been swept to his death. The worst of the storm might have been over, but the fear, another typo, fear was just as strong as it had been when the waves were breaking over their heads. The Greyhound was still crashing downward as the waves gave way, from peak to valley, and each time the hull creaked and groaned and threatened to break up entirely. Some of the crew were working. Sounds like I need to be working more frantically. Some of the crew were working frantically to bail and pump the water out from the hold. Others were desperately wadding holes with any spare cloths they could find, nailing boards of wood over top as a crude patch. All on board appeared to have lost any hope of survival. Having struggled under the weight of despair for so many weeks, John wanted to offer some comfort to the crew. "Think about it, men," he called out. "In a few days we will be safe and warm at port. We will have wine in our bellies and laughter on our faces as we recount the tale of how we survived the greatest storm any of us have ever faced. They will be lining up outside the taverns to hear us, mark my words." "No," said one sailor nearby, "in a few hours we shall be buried beneath the waves. The ship is weakened beyond all measure. We are exhausted. The instant the gale picks up again, the sea will claim us. There is no hope for us." This gets back to one of the reasons why I picked this particular section, because there's a lot of analogies here with LDS singles life. I don't know, maybe I don't think I'm alone in this. There have been times when, I've got the angel on one shoulder, the devil on the other, and, you know, one's trying to, incite positive energy and faith, and the other's trying to incite negative energy and hopelessness and despair. And that's exactly what we have here in this story, right? John trying to be positive, but there's that negativity coming in. Nobody spoke after that. It troubled John to see the men so fearful, but he knew they were right. The Greyhound was lost. If it hadn't been for all the camwood and beeswax crammed in the hold, it would have sunk already. He glanced at the damage on the starboard side of the bow, where actually I think that's bow. I'm not a nautical guy. Like, never been in the Navy. Although the Navy did try to recruit me once, but obviously they were unsuccessful if I can't say the word right. Yeah, he glanced at the damage on the starboard side of the bow where the ship had been shattered. There was a gaping hole where the upper timber should have been. John thought about the danger of being swamped again. With some urgency, he untied himself from the gunwale and went to talk to the captain at the helm. "We must change our heading," John shouted over the noise of the wind. "No matter how off course it takes us, we must keep the ruined section of the bow high out of the water." Captain Gother wiped the sweat from his eyes. "We could try. What else can we do?" John nodded. "If it will not help us stay afloat, the Lord have mercy on us." The instant the words left his mouth, John was stunned. Right, and part of the reason why the book actually gets into this earlier They make it a point that this guy is not really much of a believing Christian, right? Which is so strange because it's like, later in his life he becomes a pastor. So, but that's for later. This is this event with the storm and the destruction of the ship. And how he survives this because the ship could sink if they're not. I mean, it's just barely being kept afloat. And as you can see, they're having to keep pumping the water out in order to keep it afloat. So, you know, this is an event that transforms him and brings him more to look more towards divine assistance. The instant the words left his mouth, John was stunned. He stumbled back to his position at the pump, shocked that he had just called on God for mercy. Did that mean that somewhere inside a part of him still believed that God might choose to save them? And if he did still have eternal hope, was he nothing more than a poor deluded fool? He lashed himself back to the gunwale and resumed pumping, questions flashing like lightning across his mind. He thought about mercy and justice, punishment and sin. He wondered what would happen if the ship sank and he drowned. Would he be sent to hell for all he had done? He wondered what would happen if he survived. Would it mean that God had chosen to save him? And if that was true, why? All day John worked at the pump. His hands were bleeding, his body shivering in the cold. In the afternoon, the captain sent John back to the cabin to sleep for an hour. He lay down on the mattress that was cold and wet with sea water and closed his eyes. He had no idea whether he would wake up again, and a part of him did not care either way. There were no answers to his questions, not yet at least. Life was in the balance. Death could come at any moment. Then he would know. At 3, he was shaken awake and told to take over from the captain at the helm. Another typo. The waves were picking up again, and he steered until midnight, not so much to follow a course of any kind, but simply to keep the damaged section of the hull away from the worst of the waves. This time his mind was full of memories from his childhood. Times when he sat beside his mother while at church. The memory of the softness of her cotton dress, the way her voice soared when she sang, the way she placed every ounce of her attention on the preacher as he stood up to speak. Some of those sermons came back to him as well. He could hear his childhood pastor, David Jennings, and picture the chapel at Wapping. Wapping is the town where he grew up. He remembered being warned against sin and temptation so many times. There were calls to surrender at the foot of the cross as well. The guidance had been there, constant and consistent, yet since leaving England he knew that he had lived as though he had never stepped foot in a church, not even once. He might as well have been an infidel. All day and all evening he manned the helm, and as he piloted the battered ship he tried to find a way to keep what little faith he had mustered afloat too. It was not easy, especially when he noticed that the rest of the crew had slipped further into their own despair. There was nothing else to decide, one man concluded, after emerging from the hold and informing the crew that all provisions were now perished. Either we starve to death or we be forced before long to eat each other. Murmurs of agreement went around the crew. John expected Captain Gother to step in and say something to reassure the men. The captain remained silent, walking slowly around the ship, staring at the damage. Captain, John said quietly as he passed nearby, our sufferings are light compared to our fears. These men need reassurance and comfort, not comfort, comfort from you. The captain stopped and stared John in the eye. You are the sole cause of our calamity. You alone. You are the Jonah that has brought this horror upon us. 4 days after the storm, conditions on the Greyhound remained dire. While they had several barrels of drinking water in the hold, and a few on deck and a little brandy, there was no food apart from a little bread, the salted cod they had caught off the banks of Newfoundland, and a small quantity of pig feed. What was left of the sails was so ragged and torn that any strips of canvas left were best used to try to plug the holes in the hull that were continually letting in seawater. This left the ship lifeless, without any means of propulsion, virtually dead in the water. All they could do was hope that the gentle westerly wind at their backs would continue, while not mounting into anything more dangerous. I want to stop here and talk a little bit about analogies, because I said that there's an analogy here between this longer excerpt that I'm sharing with you and Elias Single's life. Don't all of us have a moment in our lives when there was a storm and it just changed everything? And it gave us a very bleak picture of the future. For those who are widowed, obviously, the death of a loved one can paint a bleak picture about, well, what's my life going to be now that I don't have my companion with me? Like, I mean, yeah, I mean, we all know we're like temple ceilings, and we're going to be together forever. But still, there's that moment in this life where you're alive and that other person isn't, and so there's that bleak picture. Divorce, I don't think I need to say anything about that. Obviously, divorce can paint a very bleak picture of the future. Those of us who are never married, though, some of us, I think a lot of us go through our own storm, right? There's that moment where we have an opportunity for a relationship that could save us, and yet what happens? We go through the storm and it beats the ship, and we got to be manning the pumps just to stay afloat because we really took a beating from the storm. Things didn't turn out the way we hoped. So as the crew's going through here in the story, just kind of think about that storm that might be in your life or the life of a single adult you know. The crew were largely silent as they went about their work of bailing, pumping, and replugging the holes that were constantly opening up like seeping wounds. Captain Gother let slip the odd comment to the crew about John being like Jonah, but most of the time he was quiet and solemn. Like the captain, the whole ship was subdued. The crew was like a condemned man waiting to be sent to the gallows. John was just as silent as the rest, but his mind was far away from this scene of threatened death and despair. The gloom he felt had lifted. Instead, he was contemplating the remarkable gift of life. It had taken a few days, but as it became clear that the ship might not sink after all, it slowly dawned on him that there was only one possible explanation for their survival. God had saved them. Has the saved? Oh, God had saved them. There should be no S there. Another typo. Gee, I'm kind of coming back up to par with the last time. I got to do something better about vetting these slides. When he wasn't working alongside the crew, John retreated to the cabin, reading a New Testament and a book of sermons from the captain's library. Some of the words he read struck him with such force that he had to pause and close his eyes for a moment. We can read over the whole story of the Savior's passion with dry eyes and be no more troubled at it as if we had been no way concerned with it. That was him. He had done that, even in that very cabin, less than 1 month before. He had lived that way for years too, fully aware yet utterly indifferent to the death of Jesus. I have to pause here to ask ourselves a very serious question, and that is, do we know the Savior or do we simply know of him? Obviously, we're talking about events here that are before the beginning of the Restoration. This is the 1700s here. But, the question is very clear. Do we know of the Savior or do we actually know the Savior? Shall we still live in sin, notwithstanding that our Lord has died for it? It is He who supports our spirits and carries us with patience and comfort through it. When we are in straits and know not which way to take, it is He who guides us by His counsel and directs us by His Holy Spirit to what is most for His glory and our good. Reading such words was like discovering a map that revealed not only exactly where he had been, but where he wanted to go. When we are heavy laden with the burden of our sins, it is He who gives rest and quiet to our souls. Early on the 5th day after the storm, just as the sun was rising ahead of them, the man on the lookout let out an almighty shout. "Land ahoy! Land ahoy! I see it there in the distance. Look!" The pumping and bailing and repairing paused as every man strained for a better look. "Mountains," said one. "The Blue Stacks," said another, "north of Donegal Bay. I'd know them anywhere." "2 days at most with this wind behind us, lads," said the captain, "and we'll be there. Let's have a drink." The last of the brandy was shared out, a pint for every man. They drank and stared and smiled and cheered at the thought of cheating death. Slowly, as the sun continued its gentle rise into the sky, the cheering and the smiling lessened, then faded into nothing. Within 30 minutes it was clear. There were no mountains in the distance. They were only clouds. Again, how many of us have been through those storms of Elias Single's life to find something that gives us hope that the future could actually be more to our favor, only to find that we were deceived, we were fooled, and things don't turn out the way that we thought they would. They're only clouds. So now the crew's in even more despair. "Fear not, lads," said the captain. "Land cannot be far away." His words fell on deaf ears and stone hearts. As quickly as joy had arrived that morning, despair now settled upon the crew. The next day the gentle wind that had been with them since the storm ended was gone. The air was still and lifeless. They were becalmed. Without the westerly pushing at their ragged hull, they were left drifting, motionless and trapped in the middle of the ocean, dead in the water. How many Latter-day Saint singles feel the way that's being described here of the ship, right? Like, I know there have been times in my life where I felt like this is like a very adequate description of certain moments in my life, right? I just felt like it's done. I'm dead in the water. It's like there's nothing here. The air was still and lifeless, left drifting, motionless and trapped, dead in the water. I mean, what an apt description for the feelings of many Latter-day Saint singles. With both he, with both the brandy and bread now gone, the captain cut the rations further. A handful of cod, a little less of pig grain. This was all each man was allowed. Nobody complained. Nobody had the energy. On the 6th day following the storm, the situation worsened. A new wind struck up. It was a strong southeasterly that pushed them in the wrong direction entirely. If they'd had sails and strong hull, they could. With all the typos. They could have tacked across it and pressed on more quickly, but the gash in the hull that they had patched up was on the starboard side and left them vulnerable to the force of the new wind. To keep it sheltered from the worst of the waves, the ship had to be turned to the north, taking them farther off course. From then on, the battle to survive was renewed in earnest. The ocean was nowhere near as violent as it had been in the storm, but the ship was now taking on more water than it had when it was simply drifting. The crew pumped and bailed around the clock, frantically trying to free themselves of the water that threatened to drag them down to the ocean floor. It was a battle with no end in sight. 10 days after the storm, their rations were cut again. Captain Gother made another collection of outer garments to help plug the leaks, leaving the men wearing nothing but thin cotton shirts and trousers to protect them against the cold. The only way to get warm was to work at the pumps, but with so little food, nobody had the energy to exert themselves. As each man felt weaker and weaker, they turned inward. Where there had been unity in the storm, with every man working as one, the crew of the Greyhound was now splintered and broken. Silence hung over the ship for hours on end as each man retreated deeper into his own thoughts, deeper into his own fears. Almost 3 weeks had passed since the storm when the first mate, a sinewy, leather-faced sailor named Richard Jackson, with teeth the color of ship's timbers, told the captain that they would soon need to resort to eating human flesh if they were to survive. The captain winced, checked that nobody else was nearby, and kept his voice low. For the men to eat one of their own would be an abomination. We have enough provisions at the moment. Jackson shrugged. Well, I dare say this will not be the last time we discuss this. Some of the others are looking mighty weak. If we can't have enough men pumping, we'll be feeding the sharks. The conversation was over, but neither man moved. Perhaps, said the captain, there is another way to change things. Yes? We could rid ourselves of our Jonah. You think he's the reason for all this? Jackson scoffed. I never had you down as a man for fairy tales. Have you seen him when he's not at the pump? His head is always in the Bible, but I think he finds no peace in it. And at night he shouts, troubled by some terrible dreams or other. Perhaps we would be better without his tormented soul on board. From his position behind the water barrels, John had heard everything the men had said. Jackson's suggestion had not surprised him. He was sure that cannibalism had crossed the mind of every man on the Greyhound at some point. It was an open secret that this had happened on other ships in distress, but Captain Gother's comments about him were enough to leave him anxious and breathless, just like he had been before the storm. The worst thing about the captain's words was that they were right. After the false sighting of land, it had become clear that their chances of survival were slim and dwindling further by the day. The chances of the Greyhound delivering them to safety were so low that death felt almost inevitable, and now there was talk of John himself being sacrificed for the sake of the crew. Would they really throw him overboard, believing he was the reason for their suffering? Would they eat him instead? It sounded so unthinkable, and yet the captain and Jackson discussed it with all seriousness. Faced with the fact, typos, faced with the fact that his life was in double jeopardy, John spent whatever time was awake and not at the pump reading the Bible. At first he was looking for comfort, for a sign that all the sin he had committed might not send him straight to hell. The more he read, and the bleaker the outlook for the Greyhound became, the less sure he was about his eternal salvation. He was just like the prodigal son. Having squandered everything and reached the lowest point possible, he was now determined to return home. Like the son in the parable, as he turned his back on the pigsty and began the long journey back, he was unsure what would happen when he finally arrived. Would he be accepted, or would he be judged? Would he be welcomed, or would he be shunned? No matter how many times he read about the father burning to greet his son and hosting a feast in honor of his return, John was unsure. Could he really expect God to welcome him back? Could someone like him be forgiven? Somehow, the fear eased. With every day that passed, and the Greyhound still remained afloat, and John not thrown overboard by the captain, the dread that troubled him lessened its grip. It was slow, like the task of pumping out the water from the hold, but the progress was clear. Day by day, he found that he could just about keep hope afloat. So many questions remained about whether God would actually forgive him for his wretched ways, but he knew that they would have to wait. In the meantime, it was enough just to wake up in the morning and go to bed at night, thankful for another day. The longer death was kept at bay, the more he started to believe. When the west coast of Ireland finally came into view, and the Greyhound limped along into Lough Swilly, it was early April. 27 days had passed since the storm, and the ship was half submerged and listing heavily on one side. 21 months had passed since they set sail from England, and they had lost crew. Most of the little cargo they carried was ruined, and the ship itself was so broken it would take more than a month to patch it up so that it would be strong enough to make the brief crossing from the Irish Sea to Liverpool. The emaciated crew looked as weak as the battered ship. They had eaten the last handfuls of their salted cod and pig feed, and drained the last of their water. What few clothes each man wore hung from his bones like rags, and they crept into Ireland looking more like prisoners of war than merchant sailors. There was relief etched across a few of their faces, but most bore the grim mask of the survivor. Having stared death in the face for 27 long, uncertain days, life felt like a stranger. John stood on the deck and watched the fishing boats make way to accommodate them as they progressed slowly up the narrow inlet. They had reached safe harbor at last. He returned the astonished stares, his own eyes just as wide, just as odd. As the crew made fast the ship and dropped anchor, John noticed a presence behind him. First of all, it should only be one capital letter in John. John noticed a presence beside him. Gosh, these typos are messing me over. Perhaps you were not our Jonah after all, said Captain Gother. Perhaps you brought us good luck. No, said John, not I. There's a God who hears and answers prayers. That is why we are alive today, not through our own strength, but His great mercy. This storm that he survived was a turning point in his life. And this is the moment where he began turning more and more towards God, whereas before he had actually turned away from God. And it's understandable. I mean, he was actually press ganged into the Navy and had some horrible experiences that eventually ended up being a slave himself and being very mistreated, not having any fear of, any sort of future. Yeah, it'd be easy to see why he would just say, yeah, if there is a God, he's forgotten about me. But there's something about this storm and the experience that he had here that started to turn him around. And it was a pivot point for him, a major pivot point in his life. So from this point on, he gets back on his feet, and eventually enters the slave trade, which is like, okay, but he starts to have doubts about the he starts to have doubts about his employment. He's like, I don't know that I should be doing what I'm doing. Because this what you had here in the storm was the start of a conversion journey. And he starts realizing that, yeah, some of these things with the slave trade, how about a lot of things with the slave trade, not so great, right? So here in this next scene, fast forward a little bit in the book, he's here with his wife Mary, which, by the way, is the girl that he fell in love with so long ago, right? He actually ends up marrying, you know, um, this girl that he fell in love with. So Mary's her name. Mary feels the first chill of evening as the sun begins to set. She shifts on the bench, ready to return to the rooms that Manistee has rented for them, but John is oblivious to her. He isn't moving. He is staring at the ground. I, he starts, struggling to find the net words. Since I recovered from my fever, I've been praying but one prayer. The Lord in his own time would be pleased to fix in me a more human calling. Humane calling. Mary waits for John to say more, but no words come. My dear, I do not understand. A more humane calling? The slave trade, he says, as if the words themselves are so heavy that just saying them leaves him weak. When I'm going about the business of the trade, I am nothing but a gaoler, a turnkey. All my days are full of chains and shackles and bolts. To spend one's days in such employment, it is shocking. He looks at her. And these long separations, they are hard to bear. I hope that the Lord will make me free of them one day. So here he is. He's actually moved into a place where he wants to quit the trade, but he's not really able to because he doesn't have anything else to do. Um, so he just keeps going with it because he's got nothing. He's got nothing else. It's like he wants to quit his job, but he can't because he needs the paycheck. Um, so he feels kind of trapped that way. And so here he's expressing um, prayer of the heart, you might say, um, that one day he'll be made free. And he is made free. Be careful what you wish for; you just might get it, right? How many of us have actually prayed to be free from the shackles of singleness? Um, be careful what you pray for, because the way he gets his just spoiler alert, he gets his prayer answered, but the way it gets answered, maybe he wasn't praying for that. So I say, if you're praying to, like, you're praying to get out of your singleness, be careful what you pray for. You might not like the way it happens. So yeah, here we go. 2 days before the departure of the B, this is the slave ship he's going to be captain. He's going to be captain of. Mary accompanies John on his final visit to Manistee's office. There are more maps and papers and conversations about which carpenter would be best suited for the voyage. Mary watches her husband closely, The nightmares have been worse these last few nights, so bad he has barely slept at all. It is dark in Manisty's office, and the lack of light makes him look even paler than he was in the park. She checks his hands. They are thrust deep into the pockets of his heavy woolen sea jacket. She can see the fabric strain where his fists are. Yes, Manistee is saying from behind the desk, you were wise to leave the Guinea coast so early on the African. You should do the same again on the B. Trade fast and sell faster, eh? But perhaps a few more than 87 this time. Even if you have to buy a bunch of rebels like before, just double chain them the whole way. I've made sure you have plenty of callers on board this time. Manistee carries on for a few more minutes, prattling on about the rise in prices and the challenges of making a profit. But Mary is no longer listening. She is staring at John, who is staring, not I don't even know what that word is. She is staring at John, who is staring back at his employer, giving an impression of listening to everything he is saying, but his eyes are glazed. Mary watches beads of sweat start to form on his brow. When Manistee is finished, Mary hurries John back to their lodgings. She orders tea for the landlady and urges John to rest in a chair. Before he can sit, he slumps forward and onto a dark red rug under their feet. Mary screams. John lies on his side, arms and legs twisted and twitching uncontrollably. Mary calls for help, then falls to her knees and tries to comfort her husband. My darling, she calls. John! It is no use. He cannot hear her. No matter what she says, no touch soothes him. Nothing calms him. All she can do is watch as he lies thrashing on the carpet. His face is contorted, eyes rolling, spittle forming at the corners of his mouth. Nothing like this has ever happened before. There has been no hint that John was unwell. Mary is sobbing uncontrollably. The landlady has arrived and is shouting again for the doctor, her voice so loud Mary thinks it might bring down the ceiling. And then, just as soon as it started, John's seizure ends. John, she soothes, her hand on his brow. He is burning so hot it frightens her to touch him. John, my darling, I am here. All is well. She strokes his hair and takes the cold, wet handkerchief that the landlady hands her and presses it on his forehead. Shh, she soothes as he were a child. As if he were a child. It is over now. You are safe. John's breathing is shallow, his eyes locked shut. John, she calls, risking a gentle shake on the shoulder. John, wake up. She shouts, then whispers, shakes, then caresses him. She places her head on his chest and prays. No matter what she tries, nothing works. John is locked away from her. She cannot wake him. For whole hours she stays there, kneeling on the floor next to her husband. Tears come and go, but all the time the panic rises in her throat, flooding her from within. And then, without warning, he opens his eyes. She hugs him tight, tighter than before, so tight she thinks she will never let him go again. Again, be careful what you wish for. You just might get it. So apparently he suffers this epileptic seizure. And of course, after this incident, he can't captain a ship. He can't even serve on a ship. So he's got to find a new livelihood. And this is where, he actually ends up uh, working on the dock for a while he studies and prepares to become a pastor. And so eventually he becomes a pastor and he's given a small little parish out of the country, and he begins to preach, and he completely turns his life around from what it was before. And it's here that he realizes that the Lord had answered his prayer, right? Now, the way it happened, I'm not so sure. That's why I say it's like, be careful what you ask for. You just might get it, and you might not like the way it comes to you, right? So those of us who are praying, like, help me find my one and only true love. Help me get out of this singleness. You might not like the way that prayer gets answered. Not judging, just saying. So, yes, he ends up becoming a preacher and he starts getting involved in the abolitionist movement, which toward the end of the 1700s um, in Britain was gaining momentum. Um, so he meets up with William Wilberforce, who was a member of Parliament and a key figure in the abolitionist movement. Um, in fact, I seem to remember watching a movie about William Wilberforce that was very good. I think it was called Amazing Grace. Coincidence, huh? Yeah, so yeah, I remember watching a movie like that and finding it very enjoyable. But yeah, he gets involved in the movement and he makes gains, although the gains are hard won. So there's a little bit of a history lesson on that in the epilogue of the book. So I decided, yes, let's include the epilogue because some people, I know I wasn't up on the history, so many of you may not be up on the history either, and we'll find this very interesting. So here's the epilogue. Like John Newton himself, the slave trade did not die quickly. At first, in the late 1780s, it had appeared as though the fight for the abolition of the slave trade would be won swiftly, thanks to apparently successful Privy Council and House Select Committee hearings. Yet the parliamentary bill that Wilberforce introduced immediately afterward was defeated by 163 votes to 88. After 300 years of profit, those who had built their fortunes upon the trade in human cargo were unwilling to give up without a fight. And that's the way all change goes, by the way. If there's somebody who's making a lot of money off the status quo, they're going to fight anybody who wants to change the status quo. Each year, Wilberforce introduced a bill to abolish the trade, and each year it was defeated. Those who voted against Wilberforce pointed first to the turmoil in France following the Revolution, and then to the carnage and bloodshed in Haiti when the slaves rose up and threw aside their colonial masters. Pitt, this is William Pitt, who at the time was prime minister, lost interest in abolition. The monarch directly opposed it, and throughout the 1790s, the campaign that had enjoyed such momentum a decade before appeared to be stalling. With his life's work in tatters, Wilberforce was sickened by the fact that instead of declining, the slave trade appeared to be thriving. Yet in 1804, the tide started to turn. His bill finally passed in the House of Commons. This was the abolition of the slave trade. Although it was too late to be passed in the House of Lords, so because it wasn't passed in both houses, it's not law. 3 years later, the Abolition of the Slave Trade Act finally passed and received royal assent, just 9 months before John Newton died on December 21st, 1807. The act was a significant success, but not a complete victory. The bill only stopped British ships from taking part in the trade. It would take until July 26, 1833, for slavery itself to be abolished and for those it had held captive to be emancipated. 3 days later, Wilberforce died. So, a little brief history lesson there I thought was very interesting. Um, of course, 1833, slavery is still alive and good in the United States, but the tide is starting to turn here. So I just thought getting into the history a little bit of that was very interesting. I believe I have one more excerpt to share, and this is from the afterword. So now we're out of the fiction part of the book, which is the main part of the book, and now we're back into commentary. So the authors had commentary in the introduction, and I shared some excerpts of that with you. Now I'm sharing with you an excerpt from the afterword, and the basic structure of the afterword is here's some things that we can learn from Newton's story. And this particular item I thought was very instructive, very applicable to Elias Single's life. So here we go. From Newton's story, we need to affirm the more frightening truth that we can be deeply self-deceived. The prophet Jeremiah accused God's people. On your skirts is found the lifeblood of the guiltless poor, yet in spite of all these things you say, I am innocent. This leads him to the conclusion, the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately sick. Who can understand it? He's talking here about Newton and how he was a slave and then he became a slave trader. One of the most painful things to contemplate in Newton's story is the way he could be blind, even after his initial conversion. Remember, he went through that sort of conversion experience with the storm that almost brought the whole ship down and all the crew with it. And yet he still continued in the slave trade after that conversion of, coming to realize that it's by God's mercy that you're surviving. It's by God's grace that you have what you have. Um, you might want to be, does that like not weigh in the balance of the consideration a little bit? A little bit? Um, so, yes, um, the way he could be blind even after his initial conversion to his participation in race-based chattel slavery and the brutality of the forced migration of enslaved people in the most inhumane and cruel conditions. It was one thing for polite Europeans to put sugar in their tea and not realize the horrific suffering of the plantation system and the whole bloody supply chain that made this possible. It was another for someone like Newton to choose to be a part of it, enforcing it firsthand and profiting from the trade in human flesh. According to his logbook, he bought and imprisoned, another typo, imprisoned 468 African men, women, and children on board his ships. 68 of those people died on his watch, while the rest he delivered into the deadly slave system that powered the plantations of the West Indies. He did this while simultaneously taking the first steps to place his personal faith in Christ. This blood was his hands, and it took years before he became aware how self-deceived he was. Custom, example, and interest, he wrote later, had blinded my eyes. I did it ignorantly. Think about that for a minute. Custom, example, and interest had blinded my eyes. Now, here the authors of the book are asking, could this happen to us? It would be naive to think it couldn't. If something is acceptable to everyone, custom, and everyone else is doing it, example, and it is to my benefit, interest, then we too are in danger of self-deception. There are so many examples from history of good people swept up in prejudice and then conspiring in evil. One thinks of Germany in the 1930s under Hitler, but that is only the most famous example. Majorities routinely oppress minorities and tell themselves convincing lies to justify this. Dehumanization is always a first step toward violence. For Newton and Cooper, actually I make a point in the book. It looks like the name is Cowper, but it's actually pronounced Cooper. For Newton and Cooper and their friends in the 1780s, the potent Christian conviction that had been lost and needed to be recovered was the universal dignity, significance, and worth of every human being, made in God's image and redeemed by an incarnate Savior who embraced all human flesh, including especially the weak and the vulnerable. So the reason why I selected this excerpt from the afterwards, of all the different life lessons they point out from Newton's life, is this thing about self-deception. And I wonder how many of us LDS singles are deceiving ourselves. I mean, if we don't question our thought processes, if we don't question the assumptions that underlie our ways of thinking, I think we too are, leaving ourselves very open to be deceiving ourselves. This trio of what Newton calls custom, example, and interest, right? So something is acceptable by everyone. Everyone else is doing it. It is to my benefit. And we too are in danger of self-deception. Probably one of the best examples of this that I can think of that applies to LDS singles, it's the whole idea of singles wards, right? Everyone thinks that, oh yeah, this is great. This is the best way for singles to go. So it's something that's acceptable by everyone, custom. Everyone else is doing it. Well, I mean, everyone else is doing it where the numbers are big enough. And it is to my benefit. Like we think it's to their benefit. It doesn't always benefit them, but we think that it is, right? So there you've got all three. Are we in danger of self-deception? I think I'm going to do a program on. I think I'm going to do a program on that very topic, right? This whole idea of singles words. I think I'm going to do that because that's something I think could make some very interesting content. Anywho, um, that's pretty much the end of that. So again, I enjoy the book. I give it 5 stars. I think it's fantastic. If you haven't read it, I recommend it. I think it's that good, and that's pretty much all I got for your peeps. So not sure what book we're going to pick up next. If you have a suggestion for a book that you'd like to see featured during book club, because we have these episodes about once a month, um, then yeah, just leave it in the comments down below because I'm not seeing anyone in the chat. So go ahead and leave it down below, and we'll take a look at it. But yeah, other than that, that's all I got for this episode of Join the Journey Radio. Thanks to everyone for joining in and watching. If you have something that you'd like to say about what we discussed today, leave a comment down below. If you have a topic or question you'd like to see addressed, we're happy to help. Please leave a comment down below. Um, if you Is there something that we can do to help you overcome the challenges of LDS singles life? Then yeah, you got it figured out. Leave a comment down below. Alternatively, you can also go to the contact page at jointhejourneyradio.com/contact. Send us a message with the form on that page you find there. And as always, don't forget to like, subscribe, share our content, especially what you find helpful, so that the algorithms can push more of that content you find helpful out to other Latter-day Saint singles and help them. And until next time, this is your host reminding you there is joy to be had all along your journey. So take that joy and journey on.